Hi, I'm Paul.
And I'm Tiffany.
To some, we could be called career wizards.
And to others, sometimes we seem like therapists. However, we definitely are not.
But for you, we are the co hosts of the Career Boosters podcast.
For me, the biggest thing that's next is narrowing the scope. So I think I have a good understanding of what my values are. It's now getting to that next step of really narrowing down what the foundation is and what I want to keep with me for a consistent amount of time, and then knowing when to evolve or how to evolve. So that's my next step.
Hello, and welcome to season 2, episode 10 of the
I'm
Career
running out of
Booster podcast.
fingers. I
I
don't know
know.
what I'm going to do next episode.
We need a fake hand to come in or
Yeah.
something like that.
Okay, I'll get that.
Um, and today we are going to talk a lot about values. What are values? Where do they come from? How do we know what our values are? These are all questions that we did our best to answer for MBA students in class. Today, Arjun Atwal joins us to talk about values. He's done extensive work on what his values are, and he and Tiffany discussed the opportunity to come on this show and really dive into this really important topic. As I have possibly kind of pointed out before or previously on this show, I look at values when we look at the metaphor of a house. These are our walls and foundation of who we are. To me, one of the most important things to know about ourselves are our core values. So we're going to let Arjun and Tiffany and myself dive into this topic. And Arjun, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And we're going to start with the first question, the story behind your decision to embark on an MBA journey right now.
Yeah, first off, thank you guys for having me on such a meaningful podcast. I think values are something that's really driving me forward. So thank you. And yeah, the decision to embark on the MBA for me was kind of a unique one. I went through my undergraduate studies in psychology and sociology, planning on doing a master's in physio, just being an athlete my whole life. I thought the body was something that was very interesting to me and something I was passionate about. So that was kind of my designated path. But um, it's kind of towards the latter of my undergrad. I had been a young entrepreneur throughout undergrad, so starting a hockey development program and kind of just learning based off the sport and passing that on to younger generations. The MBA kind of popped up. I actually had a very good conversation with Aileen, who works obviously at the U of A, as you guys know, as this being a very interesting program that you could really grow in. So I had never really thought about it till quite recently, and just applied. As I applied, I learned more and more about it as I researched about it, and I think it's amazing. It's an amazing program. It's more than just what you think of it as an outsider, just business. I think there's a lot of growth opportunities, a lot of networking. You meet a lot of good people, and just actually the education side as well is great. So, kind of an unorthodox journey, but yeah, it's been awesome.
And what I appreciate, mouth isn't working clearly already this morning, about conversations that you and I have had is something that you just kind of demonstrated was your openness, openness to experience, openness to considering a path that wasn't the path that you had planned out for you, but now you're on a bit of a different path, which is really quite neat. And you and I have had some conversations. You now just briefly mentioned hockey, but hockey has been a major part of your life, and it's got a really interesting tie-in to this conversation about values. So take us back a bit. Tell us a bit about your values journey and how it has been one that you've been on now for so long, and maybe the tie-in to hockey.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel that people see sports as very surface level, the competition, the aspect of playing, signing up, et cetera, et cetera. For me, it was a lot more than that. Obviously, I got in for that. I had a passion for sports. I liked playing, but at a very young age, I learned that it's a lot more than that. You learn a lot of life lessons very quickly. The values for me came in quickly. The first two that I can remember off the bat are accountability and respect. So for me, respect was kind of ingrained in our culture and in my family. So that kind of came naturally to me going through the hockey process. But being accountable and things like respecting time and respecting your peers and taking your job seriously was major parts of a team which is really good values that I learned, and I think those are my foundational values even today, or bridging off and branching into other values for me as well.
And you say they showed up early, and I want to separate a little bit out because you also mentioned
Mhm.
family being a big kind of influence, and Paul and I talked about that in class around kind of where do our even values come from. And Sonny, you've already talked about this hockey kind of growing up in this community, but also the impact of family. How have both of those two big spheres specifically impacted the growth and development of your values?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, those are kind of the pillars of what started my values for me. So first off is obviously always family, I think for everyone. Kind of those really young years between almost 0 to 10 years old, I would say. Um, that's kind of where you learn your first few values, or you probably don't recognize them at that time, but they kind of get ingrained in you, just the way kind of that nature nurture is. Things you learn that you are unconsciously learning, the ways of living, lifestyle habits. I think for me, the one I really carry forward and I can really reflect on now, looking back at those times, is respect. Just really respecting our elders is one thing we really learned through generations, parents, grandparents, etc. And my parents being immigrants, migrating here was that's a really big thing we learned just because the struggles they had as immigrants is respect really, really stood out for me. Moving forward into the hockey side, I was kind of a first generation Canadian for my family. So, um, yeah, just really learning that respect level and taking that into my approach while meeting my peers and on carving out my journey. So, um, that's where I kind of the growth for me and my values started. So I had kind of that foundation of respect and accountability, but I didn't really have an outreach more than that.
Mhm.
So for me, hockey was really learning and growing to what would have been my values identity, as
Mhm.
opposed to my parents or my family.
It's really cool. And like Tiffany had mentioned, we walk through, where do our values come from? We have value, or we have our family, we have like communities, we have experiences, we have society, right? Things like that. And I tied in, it's interesting, you're tying in sports. I tied in sports yesterday to class as well. I talked
Mhm.
about competition and excellence being one of the things that really drives me and one of the values that I really think about. And that came from sport, right? It came from the wanting to step up and wanting to contribute. But, it's interesting. You look at it as the respect thing. I look at it as it helps drive and motivate me, but it also captures this like chase for excellence, which I think is really cool too, right? And so, when you think about the intentional time that it took to kind of go through these values, what what other things have you discovered about yourself along the way? Like what are some of the other so you talk about respect. What are some of the other values that you have?
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, on that point of you mentioning competition, is that's where the competition really grew in me. I am a very competitive person, and that started with the sports foundation. So I had that respect going in, but that's one of the values I grew into was competition, or learning how to compete in a diverse setting. Teams are always very diverse, and me growing into that competition and just competing in a healthy way, obviously. You learn to drive yourself. It works on work ethic. It's you're dedicated, you're consistent, and I think those are very big values for me that I learned in sports where I grew into, and I can carry that forward into my schooling, which I did throughout, and especially now into my MBA journey is those are some big ones. It's almost like a healthy competition. You want to do well. There's things like case competitions. You compete further. There's net impact consulting. We're in a finance competition right now, so I think the competition aspect is what makes it really fun, and then you learn the values you need to do well in those competitions.
And both of you have noted and talked about, you know, growing up in spheres where values are can be handed to you, or you are in spheres where they are a little bit more obvious. And so for me, I grew up in a very faith-based sphere, and so faith is really important to me. However, Arjun, you noted that at some point you had to figure out what are my values versus my family's values, or my sports values, or my church's values, or what have you. At some point you got to figure out, is it theirs or is it mine? How has your journey been to kind of really truly parse those apart and figure out that it in fact is mine, not just a space that I have been in for a long time?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the main time I learned that was each year throughout hockey, you go through the start of the year, you start as a team, you comprise a collective values chart. This is how we were going to play and how to run, and these are the things we want to kind of do day to day. And that's kind of where it triggered for me that these are great and this is awesome that we're doing this, but there's no way these, say, five values are going to represent each individual perfectly. So that's kind of when I learned that these are the collective values, say, of our team, like the respect, the accountability, the diversity, the commitment, whatever it may be. And then for me, I would always try to branch off and give myself two or three or maybe even four or five at that time, just not knowing how to narrow really the scope. And that's kind of what it triggered for me. So the journey for me has just been what really applies to me or what is just kind of a buzzword that I want to fill in. That's a really good word, has great meaning, but it doesn't really truly apply to me. So
Mhm.
that's been my biggest challenge now, even just kind of narrowing the scope and kind of learning. And as we've had conversations, is really finding, I think, the two foundational pillars, and then you find
Nice.
the values that kind of branch out of those. So that's
Yeah.
my current challenge.
That's cool. And I think, again, something we talked about yesterday, companies have values, right? Organizations will have values, and do your values align with those ones of the companies? And sometimes they may, and sometimes they won't. They won't. But I think what is most important to me is you need to understand yourself and your own values first and foremost, right? And then you can think about that alignment piece after. So, as you've reflected on your values, what kind of questions have you found helpful to ask yourself to get some of the clarification that you need?
Yeah, for me, the biggest question is, does this really apply to me, or is it just a great word with great meaning? Just really getting that application point of, say, everyone wants to be accountable, for example, but does that apply to you or the situation you're in, the work you're trying to do, or the journey you're on? Uh, it's I think your values kind of grow or evolve as you do. You kind of have your cores that kind of stay consistent, but I think values are very evolving. They're never going to be the same, or you can't just say you narrow your scope to a couple of values and you can't just carry that out for a 20-year period. It's got to evolve and it's got to grow as long as you grow or the different journey you're on. So for me, the biggest question is, does it really apply, and how can I have that drive me forward, that value?
That's cool. When I have done a lot of work with students and their values, and I think I think about the meetings that I have, and I ask what their values are, and the two that I hear every single time are honesty and integrity. And I'm like, okay, well, like, what do those mean to you? And then we get deeper into, well, honesty means I need to show up in an authentic way. Integrity means to have responsibility, show up on time, all of those things, right? I think there's always the next layer deeper that we can kind of get to. And I wonder sometimes it must be hard for some people to dive in deeper and deeper and deeper because I think we all think honesty and integrity. I look at that as that's table stakes. That's what we should all have, should we not? And as we characterize through life and things like that. So, when narrow down these values, what does the process look like for you?
Yeah, for me, the process is kind of mapping it out. For me, I'm very visual. I just don't think I could kind of just think in my head and say this kind of clicks here and this doesn't. So for me, yeah, an example of that was activity we actually did in the orientation week where we kind of wrote out our stories. For me, that got me really thinking of, wow, that I didn't know my story was that unique or these were my core values, and you really have to think of it. So for me, I use that strategy now is kind of mapping things out. So I start with maybe what's going on in my life. The two or three key contributors right now would be schooling in the MBA and my business, and I kind of take it from there. What do I want to pass on? So for me, maybe that's teamwork and accountability at this very time. So um, really working how to work with teams and be accountable and do your role on the team, but also kind of lead and work together. And then from there, I kind of create branches where it's what values feed into these. So if these are my foundations, then like you said, say it's honesty and integrity, that could maybe be a branches of my accountability. So just kind of seeing what applies specifically and then what is kind of an outer layer.
I appreciate the term that you use, branches. So Brene Brown does a lot of work, and that's the exercise that we take everyone through in class. It comes from Brene Brown's Dare to Lead book. Anybody who wants a really good lesson in values, it's a fantastic part of that book. But she talks about understanding core values and how other values ladder up underneath those core values. Like you talked about, there's a root, and then and the word I've been using lately is what behaviors support those. And so I do have a core value of integrity, but I am very, very clear on what behaviors ladder under integrity for me, because it's not all of the words that can apply to integrity. There's some specific ones. So I appreciate your branches too, right? What are the branches out? So for your core values right now, as you understand them, how are they impacting kind of big decisions that you have now, or maybe recent ones that you've had?
Yeah, so for me, a big decision I had was kind of choosing my schooling path. That's probably the most recent big decision I've had. And for me, I really leaned on my core values. It was essentially kind of a risk stepping into a field that I'm not maybe um, most well versed in or the most confident in. However, just having that vulnerability and the understanding that maybe I need to grow and push myself in a different way was things I I guess I leaning on my values or using them to stride forward. So for me that's been the really good one now is I want to achieve something that I really haven't done. It's always kind of been sport and school collectively, like student athlete, throughout my whole life, but now it's kind of a school first priority for me. So that's kind of been a swing for me and just the learning. So kind of being vulnerable, getting uncomfortable and doing things that I wouldn't typically have time for or
Mhm.
participate in
Mhm.
has been really good. So I think the values for me that I took away the most is being vulnerable, in a good way, like an uncomfortable way. And
Mhm.
I think that's the only way to grow. Even in sport, I learned that if you're just gonna do what you're good at, then you're not gonna be very good in the end.
Mhm. Yeah, you max out at some point, right? Like you can
Exactly.
only get so good at something, and I think it's making mistakes. It's the like iterative process that it takes to kind of seek excellence and things like that, right? So you talked a little bit about being an entrepreneur. So and having your own business and my understanding a very successful business. So tell us how you worked your own values through this like creation of this new and endeavor this entrepreneurial endeavor that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the key points in my life to really understand my values was understanding my cultural identity. That happened, luckily for me, quite early on. In my earlier years, between almost 10 and 15 years old, I kind of learned that culture was important to me. Going through hockey, predominantly Canadian or white sport, you could say Caucasian. Um, you kind of stick out, obviously. But that's something I took pride in, as opposed to the negative aspect that it could be. It made me want to learn more about my culture and kind of embrace and push my limits as much as I could, being a BIPOC athlete. So that was kind of the foundation of starting my business. I call it As One Hockey, just promoting togetherness as one. That was kind of the foundation of the name. And yeah, our primary goal is just to provide guidance, mentorship, and obviously on ice training and on all that fun stuff for primarily BIPOC athletes. But of course, we have athletes of all cultures and religions. And yeah, it's just started as kind of a hobby and a passion, obviously, for the game of hockey, and it's kind of growing as I do. I think just that diversity aspect was a really core value that drove my business from just a value of mine into my business, and also that teamwork. I have a lot of former teammates that help me with my business daily, weekly, and even annually. So. Just kind of the teamwork and diversity was two values that really drove me into that.
And now you get to be the person, the leadership figure, the opportunity for you to take now young minds through this value process. You were a young mind brought through that at an early age, which I would say is a gift. Now you get to give that gift to others. How are you doing that? How are you bringing your values and values to your organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So at my camps, say for example, we always have check-ins. So we allow athletes to check in. We make sure they're on time. After day one, we have seminars, things like attire to wear to games, or how to eat, how to train, how to handle yourself, how to organize your equipment in the room. So I think those things are very foundational. They may seem like very little things or maybe obvious for some people, but I think those were the foundations for me that really taught me how I want to live and what values I want to carry forward. So just kind of
Mhm,
instilling those habits, I think, day to day, or
mhm.
those behaviors, which I think will lead into the kids having a better understanding of their values as they kind of grow into their own. And also just explaining why we do things. Growing up, I had a lot of experiences where I just kind of did things because we were told to do them. I take a different aspect of kind of picking the kids' brains before we do something. I explain it and I say, why would we do this? And then you get a variety of answers, right? There's oh, just to get better or just to work harder, the pretty generic. So it's fun to pick their brains and then explain why. And I think that helps them work harder and resonate. And they also enjoy it more once they know why they're doing it.
That's so cool. And when we think about from Tiffany and I, our philosophy around trying to educate people, it's always sharing the why, right? But it's challenging them to look at the why, but then ask really great questions to build off of that for themselves.
Yeah.
And I think that to me is crucial to learning and development and growth. And we do this all the time. Even questions, I left a meeting 5 minutes ago, and I'm like, what prompts me to ask you that question? That was what I asked the student, and they're like, oh, I have no idea. And then we walk through it and they're like, oh my gosh, it all makes sense, right? And it's just eye-opening, and I think that's so wonderful. Arjun, what is next for you in your values journey?
For me, the biggest thing that's next is narrowing the scope. So I think I have a good understanding of what my values are. It's now getting to that next step of really narrowing down what the foundation is and what I want to keep with me for a consistent amount of time, and then knowing when to evolve or how to evolve. So that's my next step.
And I look forward to being a likely small part, but I enjoyed being part of that journey with you. Values for both Paul and I are just some of the funnest playground that we get to play in. But this narrowing the scope, I think that was probably the biggest struggle in class. We had a bit of an activity where that was actually a little bit frustrating as people were trying to narrow the scope. I've experienced a lot of kind of hard thought on getting it down to my two and how I define them and what actions and behaviors come from them. So, for someone who hasn't gotten quite as far, perhaps, as you in narrowing the scope, who's a bit challenged to take these great words and find the ones that mean something to them, what advice do you have for them?
My biggest advice would be just reflect on your past, reflect on your present, and reflect on your vision of where you want to go in the future. I think for me, that's kind of how I narrowed down my scope was what value kind of trickled into all three categories. And I think that will tell you that that's something that's really stuck with you. And then you can kind of create your branches of, oh, I have these, say, 20 values staring me in the face in this list. And that's the one that kind of trickled into all three categories. And then you can see the branches after that, the words that coincide with that core value. And I think that would be my biggest advice.
That's brilliant advice. And I think you probably got more. However, we only have so much time and we've got a lightning round to get to. Are you ready? Ready for it?
Yeah, I was ready as I'll ever be, I think.
All right. Three quick questions, three gut answers. What part of your career story has given you the biggest boost?
Biggest part of my career story, I think, is understanding my cultural identity. As I mentioned earlier, just really embracing who I am, and that kind of pushed me to start my own business, and has kind of prompted me to enter the MBA journey. So, I'm looking forward to where this can go.
Mm. And what do you wish you had learned sooner?
How to reflect. I think self-reflecting is something I didn't do nearly enough, especially being an athlete, even on the student side. I think sometimes we're so focused on what we have to get done that we don't look back at what we have done. So I've only started doing that in the past handful of years. So self-reflecting would be the one thing I wish I learned earlier.
Cool. And service is something that is a part of both Paul and mine's core values, I would say. And so we're always curious to hear how service is going to show up for you in the coming week.
Yeah, so it's actually the end of the month, meaning I do my company newsletter to anyone who's attended my camps. They're added to an email list voluntarily. I send out a newsletter of daily or monthly tip of the month. That'll be something like hydration related or diet related. We have stretches of the month, fitness movement of the month, and then just general things that I've seen that have really been meaningful to me that I want to share and hopefully resonate with somebody reading the newsletter or prompt them to learn a new skill or something along those lines.
You never know quite what ripple that might create. Very cool. All right, Paul, we're ready for Paul's random question.
Arjun's very worried about this. He has no idea
Yeah.
what I'm going to ask. I actually had no idea about till about halfway through this interview or this conversation today. So Arjun, hockey, big thing for you. It has been I would say a very large part of like upbringing and background. If you were not a hockey player, what would you have done?
I was just gonna go with the easy answer. I would have been a soccer player. I played soccer till I was 14, 15, and
Yeah.
I absolutely loved it. Obviously, I
Mhm,
just went with hockey because I thought there was more professional upside living in
mhm,
Canada, and at that time there wasn't
mhm,
much of a Major League Soccer or things like that. But I
mhm.
definitely would have been some sort of athlete, whether it be soccer or some other sport. I think I just love the movement too much in the competition, so I couldn't really live without it, I think.
Well, I'm glad you were a hockey player because I can understand that when there's a running joke on how much I don't understand about soccer. So I'm happy to
Yeah.
be able to follow the hockey conversation with you.
Yeah.
Arjun, you and I've had a few conversations so far. I am your coach, so we interact a little bit more. And what I have been impressed by so far is that you, from a very young age, have leaned into the opportunity of sport. Lots of kids are involved and are offered the opportunity, but not everybody leans in, and not everybody leans in the way that you have. And the stories that you have shared with me, and the ways I have seen your values work through sport, but also that you have told me. So it tells me you have the self reflection. You have the ability to look back and see where that has impacted you, and the ability to look forward and see where it's going to impact you. And that's really powerful. And it's already kind of inspired me a little bit. And I'm really excited to see where this takes you. Welcome to the MBA, the path that wasn't necessarily planned for you. We are super glad you are here. And thank you for sharing a little bit about your values with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, like you said, meeting with you almost biweekly here has been very good. The main takeaway I have right now is just defining those values, which really prompted kind of all my answers and the self-reflection today. So thank you guys for having me, and it was a pleasure being on the Career Boosters podcast.
You're welcome. All right. Key takeaways. For me, there was a sentence that stood out to me, and it's when he said, does this really apply to me, or is it a great word with a great meaning? And in class, I mentioned the sentence that, if you're struggling to narrow down to some core values and you kind of just give up, really, if you value everything, you value nothing. And how topical, there's so much in our life that we think we should do. It's a good thing. There's lots of good things to do. Is it a great word with great meaning, or is it actually for me? And how do you tell the difference? And that's all through self-reflection, which he talked about as well. But that stood out for me. You, Paul?
That's fascinating. And I think we all see these flashy words of we need to have this as a core
Mhm.
value. And, I have an internal dialogue like being with empathy being one of my core values. It's like that's an easy thing
Mhm.
to say, right? And I gave the description. I'm like, it's not living in other people's shoes, it's placing my shoes beside them and being there for other people, right? So I think that there yeah, you need to really live it and need to know and understand it. For me, the key takeaway, I'm pulling from a word that like hit me when he said it. It was respect, and that's one of his core values. I look at respect for self, so willingness to dive into here's how I'm unique, here's how I'm different. I think that's really important, but also respect of others, so external respect as well. And I think the way we can do that is ask great questions and show curiosity and just truly appreciate where other people come from. So that's what I took
Mhm.
away was respect.
It's a strong word. Well, that was it on values. Next week is a topic that Paul and I love to talk about, and we do a lot of talking about it, and it's strengths. So we will be back next week to talk more about strengths. Catch you next week. Thanks for tuning in to the Career Boosters podcast. We hope you had a blast. Yeah, we know that's corny. Catch you next time, and remember to subscribe wherever you enjoy podcasts.